It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. Some of you are familiar with some of the great products which came out of the Seattle area during the 90s, like Soundgarden and Nirvana, Kurt Cobain and so on. Well, one of the products that you're not aware of is Dr. Louis Komjathy. Dr. Komjathy I met when he arrived at Boston University in the late 90s to become a graduate student of the famous Taoism scholar Livia Cohn. And Louis ended up doing a wonderful doctoral dissertation, which became his first book on the Complete Perfection School of Taoism, which began in the 12th century, and it's kind of a combination of classical Taoism and some Buddhist influences. And it's really the major lineage of Taoism that survived into the present. Very unusual in the field of religious studies, but something that we're hoping that there will be more of is contemplative religious studies professors and scholars and researchers who have deep contemplative training in the contemplative tradition, as well as the ability to do first-rate scholarship. And Dr. Komjathy is ordained as a Taoist priest at the Huashan Temple. It's part of the Churanjun lineage, and he's now a professor at the University of San Diego. He also started the Taoist Studies group within the American Academy of Religion, and he is also the founder and organizer of the Contemplative Studies group in the American Academy of Religion. He's got one book published and a whole bunch of other books either completed or on the drawing boards. So it's with great pleasure that I would like to ask you to welcome Dr. Louis Komjathy.
So can you see okay, or do I need to dim the lights even more? You can read the text. That's what I was wondering about.
Better.
I don't want to go too much farther, because then I won't be able to read the paper, which might not be a bad thing, but... Oh, is there a light here? Ah, okay. So I can go more. How is more? Looks like that's it. Can you read it moderately well?
Yes.
Oh, we can turn. Oh, is that better?
The other ones maybe swap. Yeah. Perfect.
That works?
Yeah.
Okay. And you can hear me okay with this? All right, well, thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Professor Harold Roth and the faculty members of the Departments of Religious Studies and East Asian Studies, as well as the Contemplative Studies Initiative, for the opportunity to speak to you today. If you've not done so already, please silence your cell phones. So the title of my talk is on Taoist meditation. A young Taoist aspirant heard that there was a Taoist meditation master living in a secluded mountain hermitage. One day he resolved to visit the master and to request to become his disciple. After the young Taoist arrived at the rough-hewn door of the master's hut, he knocked, but there was no answer. Thinking that the master was out, perhaps collecting firewood or pine nuts, the aspirant waited outside the door, sitting on the porch. An hour passed, then two. Dusk arrived, and the young Taoist began to worry about the incoming darkness. He decided to go into the hermitage. When he entered, he saw the old master and one of his companions of the Tao sitting in deep meditation. They were unmoving, resembling withered wood and dead ashes. The adept waited for them to finish, believing that they would quickly suspend their meditation practice when they became aware of his presence. However, another hour passed without the masters completing their meditation session. The aspirant then looked at the seat next to them, took his seat, and continued his apprenticeship in meditation. This well-known story from the Taoist oral tradition draws our attention to the importance of intensive and prolonged meditative practice, of guidance under a teacher, and of community in the Taoist tradition. Meditation is a central Taoist religious practice though Taoist meditation refers to many different techniques with distinct informing worldviews and projected goals. In addition, it most often occurs within a larger training regimen. During our time together, I will first provide some theoretical reflections on the academic study of contemplative practice. This will be followed by the topic proper, namely the types and styles of Taoist meditation, with particular attention to the historical and practical dimensions. I will conclude my talk with some thoughts on the larger application of the study of Taoist meditation for the emerging field of contemplative studies. Contemplative practice is a more encompassing comparative category with some rough equivalents to meditation, quote unquote. However, unlike meditation, which sometimes implied seated postures and which is often reduced to Buddhist meditation, contemplative practice functions as a larger umbrella category. In terms of religious traditions, it encompasses meditation and contemplative prayer. As such, it challenges us to investigate religious practice from a nuanced and comprehensive perspective. It also requires reflection on the heuristic value, that is, the interpretive value and relationship among meditation, prayer, ritual, among other comparative categories. One possible connected strand among various types and styles of contemplative practice involves the development of attentiveness, awareness, internal silence, and a sense of deepened meaning and purpose. As is the case in the academic study of mysticism, there are a variety of viable interpretive approaches to the study of contemplative practice and contemplative experience. Okay. These include, but are not limited to, theoretical, contextualist, textual, experiential, psychological and neuroscientific, comparative, as well as interdisciplinary and multi-perspectival approaches. A theoretical approach emphasizes philosophical questions, such as the conception and relative importance of the body in contemplative practice. Such an approach requires familiarity with specific exempla, so that theory both informs the interpretation of the practice and is informed by careful study of particular phenomena, whether texts or living communities. A contextualist approach emphasizes locating specific practices and experiences in their associated cultural and social contexts. It is often historical, but a contextualist approach may also focus on living communities and traditions. As I will discuss momentarily, from my perspective, a thorough contextualist approach would locate religiously committed contemplative practice in its larger communal, soteriological, and theological context. A textual approach focuses on texts, but here one needs to consider the spectrum of textual expression, from autobiography and hagiography to meditation manuals, poetry, and so forth. That is, attention to genre, writing style, and audience is important. In the case of religious studies, the inherent limitations of textual study has been noted, so many scholars have turned their attention to ethnography, including participant observation, and to personal autobiography, that is, first-person discourse. Such an approach might be labeled participatory and experiential. Here one might approach the study of contemplative practice from a more objective, quote-unquote, or neutral, quote-unquote, perspective, such as through the use of participant observation ethnography. This might involve interviewing adherents, site visits, and/or community-based experiences. On the other end of the spectrum, one might actually participate in and document living contemplative communities through direct personal experience among them. Although a source of anxiety for many scholars of religion, an inclusive participatory approach would include scholar practitioners and adherents. That is, this approach makes space for critical first-person discourse and subjective experience. There are a variety of psychological approaches to the study of contemplative practice, but for present purposes, four stand out: developmental, humanistic, transpersonal, and contemplative. The connective strand here involves a view of meditation as contributing to human fulfillment and actualization, whether conceived existentially or theologically. I have connected this approach to a neuroscientific one because some psychological accounts tend to emphasize physiology. More properly speaking, the neuroscientific approach to contemplative practice tends to focus on brain anatomy and function, as well as associated mental capacities and conscious states. In the case of contemplative studies, one interesting development is neurophenomenology, a methodology associated with Varela and his colleagues, in which one compares neuroimages with subjective accounts of contemplative experience. Interestingly, preliminary research indicates that advanced meditators provide accounts of transformations of consciousness that are confirmed by neuroimaging technology in terms of specific brain states and associated functions. On the most basic level, a comparative approach compares forms of contemplative practice, noting similarities and differences within and across styles and traditions. It might be moderately comparative, drawing insights from the study of a different tradition, or strongly comparative, actually giving attention to two or more examples. A comparative approach also tends to engage in categorization and typologies or cartographies. Finally, an interdisciplinary approach would be multi-perspectival, combining these and other approaches in order to provide a comprehensive and integrated account of contemplative practice and experience. In addition, in the emerging interdisciplinary field of contemplative studies, it would make space for the investigation and practice of dance, painting, photography, sculpture, music, and so forth as contemplative practice. Moving into religious studies proper, which is my field and primary interest, I would advocate an integrated approach to the study of religiously committed contemplative practice. This approach is comparative, cross-cultural, and interdisciplinary. It is also inclusive and pluralistic. By this I mean that it does not privilege one tradition or one type of meditation as normative. An inclusive and pluralistic approach helps to overcome the frequently unrecognized bias in the academic study of meditation. For example, an undue attention to Buddhist meditation, the use of Buddhist distinctions such as samatha, calming, and vipassana, insight or mindfulness, and or equating the comparative category of meditation with non-theistic, emptiness-based forms of meditation. In place of this, I would suggest that we utilize contemplative practice in a fashion parallel to mystical experience in an inclusive way. Specifically, we would include various forms of prayer, including theistic and devotional practices, such as Catholic Dominican prayer and visualization practices, like Pure Land visualization. That is, we would begin with hermeneutical openness. Such an interpretive endeavor emphasizes dialogical inquiry, with theory informing interpretation and careful and detailed study informing theory. My proposed religious studies approach also emphasizes the importance of contextualization, both historical and practical. Practical contextualization gives attention to the community-based and tradition-specific elements of religiously committed contemplative practice. This involves not extracting meditation from its larger religious tradition and not reducing meditation to technique. An integrated and comprehensive understanding of contemplative practice would have to consider other dimensions, such as dietetics, ethics, ritual, scripture study, and so forth. Where does contemplative practice end and begin? Thus, in order to fully understand contemplative practice, one must consider the larger soteriological system and informing theology. I use soteriology and theology as comparative categories. Here, soteriology refers to actualization, liberation, perfection, salvation, or however an individual or community defines the ultimate goal of religious practice. Theology refers to discourse on or theories about the sacred, with the sacred differing depending on the tradition under consideration. In theorizing religious practice, and contemplative practice in particular, I would thus suggest that we give attention to the complex interplay and interrelationship among informing worldviews, specific practices, related experiences, and projected goals. We may think of these in terms of individual adherents and or religious communities. When I say that these are interrelated, I mean that each informs and expresses the other. Worldviews inform practices, experiences and goals, but these are embodiments, literally and symbolically, of those worldviews. Specific practices and experiences only make sense within a larger framework of doctrine and imagined accomplishment and outcome. As a final theoretical and interpretive point, one which comes from careful study of contemplative practice in general and Taoist meditation in particular, I would emphasize the multidimensional nature of contemplative practice. We should not reduce contemplative practice to method or technique. Instead, we should be attentive to at least the following dimensions. Posture, breathing, for example, is it regulated or unregulated? Technique, style, for example, individual or communal, lay or monastic. Location, for example, the relative importance of place and contemplative spaces. Aesthetics and material culture, including art, clothing, and paraphernalia. And the larger religious system within which religiously committed contemplative practice occurs. As mentioned, the latter would include dietetics, ethics, ritual, scripture study, and so forth. In the present talk, I will give particular attention to the technical specifics of Taoist meditation methods. First, it is important to have at least a rudimentary and foundational understanding of Taoism, especially since misconceptions concerning Taoism are so widespread. Taoism, the tradition of the Tao, is an indigenous Chinese religion deeply rooted in traditional Chinese culture. At the same time, it has now become a global religious and cultural phenomenon, characterized by ethnic and cultural diversity. Here we should note the widespread misinterpretation of Taoism as divided into so-called philosophical Taoism, strike through, and so-called religious Taoism, strike through. These modern concepts are rooted in colonial, missionary, and Orientalist legacies. As careful historical and textual study of classical Taoism, such as that conducted by Professor Roth, indicates, classical Taoism was a religious community composed of master-disciple lineages. In addition, there are actually major similarities and continuities, including shared values, commitments, and practices among the early intercultivation lineages and the organized tradition. The primary emphasis throughout Taoist history has been on the Tao, which is a Taoist cosmological and theological concept. It's intentional. This kind of attempt to represent the unrepresentable, how do we do that? Do we do it through blackness? Do we do it through silence? How do we represent the unrepresentable, which is what the Tao is? From a Taoist perspective, the Tao is a Chinese character designating the sacred or ultimate concern of Taoists. As a Taoist theological and cosmological concept, the Tao has four primary characteristics: the source of everything, an unnameable mystery, an all-pervading sacred presence, so connected to a worldview based on qi, which is translated anachronistically as energy, and universe as cosmological process, or nature considered as a whole. That is, the primary Taoist theology is apophatic, monistic, panentheistic, and panenhenic. The secondary Taoist theology is animistic and polytheistic. Generally speaking, Taoists believe that the world itself, including sentient beings, is a manifestation of the Tao. The universe is the Tao on some level. This world-affirming and body-affirming view extends to human beings, whose innate nature, Xing, is the Tao. Taoism is a religious tradition characterized by diversity and inclusivity. There is no founder or central scripture, though the pseudo-historical Lao Tzu or Zhang Daoling have been nominated as the former, while the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, has been nominated for the latter. In fact, different Taoist texts receive a place of veneration in different Taoist movements. Generally speaking, Taoists place a strong emphasis on community, cultivation, embodiment, lineage, ordination, and place. There are various Taoist communities, including eremitic, householder, and monastic. Taoism is generally divided into movements, schools, and lineages. So considered from an integrated and comprehensive perspective, Taoist training includes aesthetics, dietetics, ethics, health and longevity practice, meditation, ritual, scripture study, and so forth. Thus, there are many viable paths to the Tao, including diverse forms of contemplative practice. Although research on the entire spectrum of Taoist contemplative practice is just beginning, we may identify 5 major types. So these 5 major types include apophatic meditation, for which there are various technical terms such as quiet sitting, jing zuo, fasting the heart-mind, xin jai, sitting in forgetfulness, zuo wang, or guarding the one, shou yi. Second, visualization, cun xiang. Third, ingestion, fu qi. Fourth, inner observation, nei guan. And lastly, internal alchemy, or nei dan, which includes actually female alchemy. So there's specific methods that developed for women's practice in particular. So this is called New Dan. Briefly stated, apophatic meditation emphasizes emptying and stilling the heart-mind, the seat of emotional and intellectual activity from a traditional Chinese perspective, until one becomes empty and still. Visualization, which literally means something like maintaining thought, involves visualizing and possibly imagining or actualizing. This is one of the interpretive questions. Is it imagination or is it actualization of specific deities, constellations, colors, and so forth? Ingestion, which literally means eating qi, involves taking the energies of the cosmos into one's body and incorporating them into one's being. Typical examples include ingesting solar, lunar, and astral effulgences and cosmic ethers or vapors. There is some overlap between visualization and ingestion. If one were more radical, one might categorize ingestion as a form of Taoist dietetics, as well as meditation. Adapted from Buddhist Vipassana, so Sanskrit Vipassana practice, inner observation involves exploring the body as an internal landscape. Finally, internal alchemy involves complex, stage-based practices aimed at psychosomatic, including physiological and energetic transformation. Later, methods specifically practiced by women called female alchemy developed. I will provide specific examples of the associated methods in a moment. Although each major type of Taoist meditation survives into the modern world, especially in more integrated training regimens, each has a corresponding historical source point and associated seminal texts. So sorry, right? This is a kind of overdone PowerPoint slide, but we need it. So I apologize for being so text heavy. Considered chronologically then, so I gave you the 5 types, and here's the corresponding periods. Apophatic meditation is the earliest type of Taoist meditation. It was practiced by members of the early inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism from the 4th to the 2nd centuries BCE. Associated texts include the Lao Tzu, which I would translate as the Book of Venerable Masters, not the Book of Master Lao, the Zhuangzi, the Book of Master Zhuang, and selections from the Guanzi, Book of Master Guan, the Huainanzi, the Book of the Huainan Masters, and the Lushi Chuanqiu, the Spring and Autumn Annals of Master Lu. The inner cultivation lineages were a diverse group of master-disciple lineages. They placed primary emphasis on attaining mystical union with the Tao. So Professor Roth is one of the foremost authorities on this period of Taoist history. The second, visualization, is first documented in early and early medieval Taoism from the 2nd century CE to the 6th century. Key early and seminal texts include the 2nd century Lao Tzu Zhongjing, the central scripture of Lao Tzu, the 3rd century Huangting Jing, the scripture on the yellow court, and the 4th century Dadong Zhenjing, the perfect scripture of great profundity. Visualization was first practiced by members of the Taiping, Great Peace, Tai Ching, Great Clarity, and Shangqing, Highest Clarity movements, although it was fully systematized by Shangqing. Shangqing was an aristocratic Taoist movement. It focused on a series of revelations given to the spirit medium Yang Shi who lived from 330 to 386. Shangqing adherents emphasized cosmic integration and self-divinization, so that is making oneself into a god. This is so much the case that some Shangqing texts verge on being proto-Neidan, or internal alchemy. The research of the late Isabelle Robinet is especially important here. Ingestion is also first documented in early medieval Taoism. Representative texts include the Tai Ching Fu Qi Koujie, the oral instructions on ingesting qi from Tai Ching, and the Fu Qi Jing Yi Lun, the discourse on the essentials of ingesting qi. Ingestion was also a central practice in the early Shangqing system. Fourth, inner observation appears during the beginning of late medieval Taoism, specifically during the Tang Dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907. It developed under the influence of Buddhist vipassana, mindfulness, or insight meditation. Key early texts include the Neiguan Jing, the scripture on inner observation, and the Dingguan Jing, the scripture on concentration and observation. Inner observation was especially prominent in late medieval Taoist monasticism. Late medieval Taoist monasticism was a fully integrated system in which Shangqing was the highest ordination rank. The research of Livia Cohn is especially important on this particular topic, inner observation. And then finally, internal alchemy was first systematized in the context of late medieval Taoism, specifically during the later Tang and early Songjin period, so the 10th to the 12th centuries. Key early representative and seminal texts include the 10th century Chuan Dao Ji, the anthology on transmitting the Tao, the 11th century Wu Jianpian, chapters on awakening to perfection, 13th century Dadan Zhizhi, the direct pointers to the great elixir, and so forth. Early internal alchemy was practiced by members of the Zhonglu, Nanzong, that is the Southern School, and the Quanzhen complete perfection movements. Internal alchemy incorporates earlier practices into integrated systems. It uses Chinese medical views, I Ching hexagrams and trigram symbology, earlier external alchemy terminology, and so forth. In concert with ritual, internal alchemy became the primary form of Taoist religious practice from the late medieval to the contemporary period. Its study is only beginning, but some important information appears in the work of Joseph Needham, Farzine Baldrian-Hewson, Catherine Despew, and Fabrizio Pragadio. I have also published a recent study of the Quanzhen system. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of background on the types and the history. So now I'll kind of go through the methods, the techniques in detail. So first, apophatic meditation. Taoist apophatic meditation, also referred to as quietistic meditation, is the earliest form of Taoist contemplative practice. In terms of historical origins, it is associated with the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. Apophatic meditation focuses on emptiness and stillness. It is contentless, non-conceptual, and non-dualistic. One simply empties the heart-mind of all emotional and intellectual content. Disengaged from conventional perceptual and cognitive processes, the culmination, quote-unquote, of apophatic meditation resembles the state that Robert Casey Foreman of Forge Institute and his colleagues have described as pure consciousness events, PCEs. Although textual descriptions date back to the Warring States period, 480 to 222 BCE, such practice, specifically in the form of quiet sitting, Jingzuo, remains central in contemporary Taoism. So contemporary Taoists still practice a form of this. The classical locations for instructional approximations of apophatic meditation are contained in the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, although recent work by Professor Roth has drawn attention to other texts, specifically the so-called Xin Shu, the techniques of the heart-mind chapters of the Guanzi. According to the Neya, the aspiring Taoist adept engages in a contemplative process involving fourfold alignment. Although the Neya emphasizes aligning the body and the four limbs, it does not indicate whether this is a seated posture. It is possible that the corresponding posture involved lying down, as was the case in some slightly later forms of Taoist meditation. However, supplementing the technical instructions from the Neya with other classical Taoist texts, one finds that sitting, or zuo, is emphasized. We do not know the specific body configuration, but my preliminary research suggests that it probably involves sitting on the heels in a fashion that parallels the Japanese seiza position. Consulting other materials, such as murals and statuary, we find that such a posture was fairly standard. This research is, however, preliminary and problematic. I'm talking about myself. These materials come from the Eastern or later Han Dynasty, so 25 to 220 CE, about 300 years after the classical Taoist texts. Unfortunately, I've not been able to locate any Warring States or early Han materials. So the two images at the top are related to Liubo, literally the 6 sticks, which was an ancient Chinese board game. The 3 images below are related to the Han cult of immortality. Now, as you can see, regardless of the other things that are going on in these representations, all the figures are sitting on their heels. And this is especially illuminating with respect to Liubo, as it would have been an activity similar to meditation in terms of style and duration. After the introduction of Buddhism during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, and after Buddhism became increasingly influential during the 4th century, Taoists began adopting its meditative postures. So, in the organized Taoist tradition, full lotus and so-called modified Burmese posture became standard. That is, they weren't sitting on their heels for the most part. Within classical Taoist texts, the practice of apophatic meditation is referred to as shouyi, guarding the one, baoyi, protecting the one, baopu, embracing simplicity, xinjai, fasting the heart-mind, zuowang, sitting in forgetfulness, and so forth. In the later Taoist tradition, shouyi, guarding the one, becomes both a general name for Taoist meditation as well as a reference to specific non-apophatic types of Taoist meditation. So when you're looking at the kind of indigenous technical terms, we have to be thinking about the context and the context-specific meaning of the terminology. Taoist apophatic meditation involves emptying and stilling the heart-mind, as I mentioned, the seat of emotional and intellectual activity from a traditional Chinese perspective. The heart-mind, Xin, is both the physical heart and mind in a more abstract sense. So this is a psychosomatic view of personhood. In addition, in certain early Taoist systems, paralleling classical Chinese medicine, the heart is the storehouse of Shen, or spirit, associated with consciousness and various numen abilities. So some people talk about this as divine capacities. There are, in turn, a variety of passages in the Tao Te Ching that describe apophatic meditation, though they tend to be de-emphasized in conventional and popular readings of the text, which ignore its religious dimensions. Some of the chapters are technical descriptions. So for example, if you're interested, chapters 10 and 16, I think are clearly technical descriptions, while others require more attentive reading. According to chapter 20, for example, quote, "Renounce learning and be free from sorrow. Positive and negative, what's the difference? Beneficial and harmful, where's the distinction? What humans fear cannot but be feared. Because they are uncultivated, fear has not yet ended. Most people are busy as though attending the Tai Lao feast, as though ascending a tower in spring. I alone am unmoving, showing no sign. I resemble an infant who has not yet become a child. Lazy and idle as though there is no place to return. Everyone has more than enough. I alone appear as though abandoned. I have the heart-mind of a fool, chaotic and unpredictable. Ordinary people are bright and clear. I alone appear dim and indistinct. Ordinary people are inquiring and discerning. I alone appear hidden and obscure. Like an ocean in its tranquility, like a high wind in its endless movement, each person has his reasons. I alone am insolent, as though unconcerned. I alone am different from other people. I revere being fed by the mother." End quote. While the Tao Te Ching is a multivocal and polysemic anthology, and while different Taoists have read it differently throughout Chinese history, I would suggest that chapter 20 is pivotal for understanding Taoist apophatic meditation. It depicts the Taoist adept in meditative seclusion. as the repetition of the phrase alone or in isolation, du, indicates. Such practitioners remove themselves from ordinary human concerns, both physically and psychologically. Supplementing the description with other sources, the adept sits in silence. He or she disengages the senses and allows the turbidity to become clear. So this is a reference to chapter 15, the dust to settle. By applying Wu Wei, non-action, effortless activity, and non-interference as a contemplative principle, the adept's heart-mind returns to its original state of open presence. This is a state of emptiness and stillness in which one is aligned with the numinous presence of the Tao. The ultimate goal of mystical union with the Tao is emphasized with phrases like dim and indistinct, and hidden and obscure, both descriptions of the Tao in classical Taoism. In addition, the final line, being fed by the mother, also refers to mystical union. Throughout the text of classical Taoism, the Tao is described as mother, origin, source, root, ancestor, and so forth. Being fed by the mother is thus a technical and esoteric reference to meditative praxis, cosmological attunement, and mystical union. More explicit descriptions of Taoist apophatic meditation appear in the 4th century BCE inner chapters of the Zhuangzi, the Book of Master Zhuang, where it is presented as fasting of the heart, mind, and sitting in forgetfulness. The relevant passages appear in chapters 4 and 6, respectively. Quote, "You must fast. I will tell you what that means. Do you think that it is easy to do anything while you still have a heart-mind? If you do, the luminous cosmos will not support you. Make your aspirations one. Don't listen with your ears, listen with your heart-mind. No, don't listen with your heart-mind, listen with chi. Listening stops with the ears, the heart-mind stops with joining, but chi is empty and waits on all things. The Tao gathers in emptiness alone. Emptiness is the fasting of the heart-mind." End quote. And the second important passage, quote, "I'm improving. I can sit and forget. I smash up my limbs and body, drive out perception and intellect, cast off form, do away with understanding, and make myself identical with great pervasion. This is what I mean by sitting in forgetfulness." End quote. As is the case with other related passages in the Zhuangzi, so for example, Woman Crookback's instructions on Taoist practice in chapter 6, here we seem to have a quasi-stage-based process of meditative discipline. First, one withdraws from sensory engagement with the phenomenal world. Then one empties the heart-mind of intellectual and emotional content. Finally, one enters a state of cosmological integration wherein chi, subtle breath, or one's vital force is the primary layer of being that one listens to. This condition is described as unity, yi, emptiness, kong or shu, and identification, tong. As the Tao is stillness from a Taoist perspective, by entering one's own interior silence, one returns to one's innate nature, which is the Tao. Interestingly, these passages remain central in the contemporary Taoist meditation practice, specifically in certain instructions on quiet sitting, Jing Zuo. As I will discuss tomorrow, a number of Taoists describe the foundational practice by citing and commenting on the Xing Jai and Zuowang passages. According to this approach, one begins by listening to the center of the head, so one brings one's listening into the center of the head. Then one rests one's gaze on the tip of the nose. The gaze or one's awareness and intent then sinks down the front center line of the body to rest in the lower elixir field, the dantian, which is the lower abdominal region. This is the primary storehouse of qi in the body. One practices forgetting until even forgetting is forgotten. Visualization is the next major form of Taoist meditation. In terms of historical origins, it was first systematized in the early Shangqing, or highest clarity movement of early medieval Taoism. Visualization involves visualizing or imagining the inner regions of the body, the microcosm, and outer realms of the universe, the macrocosm. Vision and imagination are the primary faculties utilized here. While there are many complex Taoist visualization practices, 2 representative examples will suffice. One of the most representative types of Taoist meditation focuses on the sun, moon, and stars. In the Jingque Dijun Sanyuan Zhen Yi Jing, the scripture on the perfect ones of the 3 primes by the Lord Gold Tower, part of the original 4th century highest clarity revelations, aspiring adepts are instructed to visualize the Northern Dipper, that is the Big Dipper or Ursa Major, according to the method of guarding the one. So you see, now we have Shou-Yi being used for some completely different kind of practice. This practice is also called guarding the 3 ones, or Shou-San-Yi. Quote, at midnight on Li Chun, that is, spring begins this node approximately February 2nd, practiced aligned meditation, Zheng Zuo, facing east. Exhale 9 times and swallow saliva 35 times. Then visualize the 7 stars of the Big Dipper as they slowly descend towards you until they rest above you. The dipper should be directly above your head, with its handle pointing forward, due east. Visualize it in such a way that the stars Yin Essence and Perfect One are just above the top of your head. The 2 stars Yang Brightness and Mysterious Darkness should be higher up. In addition, Yin Essence and Yang Brightness should be toward your back, while Perfect One and Mysterious Darkness are in front. Though the image may be blurred at first, concentrate firmly and focus it in position. Then concentrate on the Venerable Lords, the 3 ones. They appear suddenly in the bowl of the dipper above your head. Before long, their 3 ministers arrive in the same way. After a little while, observe how the 6 gods ascend together to mysterious darkness from where they move east. When they reach the celestial pass, they stop. Together they turn and face your mouth. See how the upper prime supports the upper minister with his hand, how the middle prime supports the middle minister, and how the lower prime supports the lower minister. Then take a deep breath and hold it for as long as you can. The upper prime and his minister follow this breath and enter your mouth. Once inside, they ascend and go to the palace of Niwan in the head. Take another breath as deep as you can. The middle prime and his minister follow this breath and enter your mouth. Once inside, they descend and go to the Scarlet Palace in the heart. Take yet another breath as deep as you can. The lower prime and his minister follow this breath and enter your mouth. Once inside, they descend and go to the lower cinnabar field in the abdomen. Next, visualize the star celestial pass and bring it down to about 7 inches in front of your mouth. While this star stands guard before your mouth, the 3 ones firmly enter into their bodily palaces. With this complete, concentrate again on the perfected to make sure they are all at rest in their residences. From then on, whether sitting or lying down, always keep them firmly in your mind. At any point during practice, if concerns or desires arrive in your mind, it will push to pursue them. Then, however much the mind strains to break free, make sure to keep it firmly concentrated on the 3 ones. See that you remain at peace and in solitude. Moreover, if your room is quiet enough, you may continue to practice well into the day. End quote. So that was a lot of information. So this will help. Right? So these are the names of the stars of the Dipper, according to the Taoism. Within this method, the Taoist adept visualizes the Big Dipper above his or her head. The 2 lower stars of the Dipper bowl rest in close proximity to the top of the head, while the handle extends forward so that the 7th star, called Celestial Pass, rests in front of the mouth. At the beginning of spring, one faces east. That is, one enters a posture of cosmological alignment based on the 5 phases. So here, wood, spring, and east. One in turn visualizes the 3 ones, also known as the 3 primes of the 3 purities in the Dipper bowl. The 3 purities represent primordial ethers and cosmic chi, the earliest emanations of the Tao. They are the highest deities, quote-unquote, of the Taoist pantheon. They are usually represented in anthropomorphic form, like 3 old Chinese men wearing Taoist ritual vestments. According to this method, the three purities ascend together to the 4th star, mysterious darkness, move to the 7th star, the celestial pass, and wait there facing towards the adept's mouth. The Adept then visualizes each one in sequence, so the upper, middle, and lower entering their respective corporeal locations. Niwan, that is in the center of the head, the Scarlet Palace, the heart, and the Cinnabar field, which are called the three Cinnabar fields, or the three elixir fields. In this way, the three heavens and their corresponding gods become located in the Taoist adherent's very own body. The text in turn advises the Taoist aspirant to use the same instructions for the commencement of the other seasons. That is, Li Xia, summer begins around May 5th, facing south. Li Qiu, autumn begins around August 8th, facing west. And Li Dong, winter begins around November 11th, facing north. The corresponding time seems to be the same, namely 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. There are thus seasonal, cosmological, and theological dimensions of the practice. Another distinctively Taoist visualization method centering on the Big Dipper appears in the 4th century Dongfang Jing, the scripture on the cavern chamber. The Dongfang, or cavern chamber, of the text title refers to one of the 9 palaces, which are the 9 Taoist mystical cranial locations. That is, you have 9 palaces in your brain that you can access through Taoist practice. According to this text, the Taoist adept visualizes and then locates each of the 7 stars in its corresponding body organ. As such, this method falls somewhere between the categories of visualization and ingestion, as one seems to be taking the actual energies of the stars into the body. This method is called returning to the origin, Hui Yuan, and the corresponding illustration orients the Big Dipper in the reverse manner from the above-mentioned technique for guarding through it. So you can see it's upside down compared to the other one. That is, the bowl of the Big Dipper is upside down with the handle pointing backwards. One begins by visualizing the first star of the Big Dipper, Yang brightness, descending into and connected to the heart. This is followed by locating the 2nd star, Yin essence, in the lungs, the 3rd star, Perfect One, in the liver, the 4th star, Mysterious Darkness, in the spleen, the 5th star, Cinnabar Prime, in the stomach, and the 6th star, North Coleman, in the kidneys. The practice concludes with visualizing the 7th star, Celestial Pass, descending into and connected to the eyes. The latter is noteworthy, as more standardized Taoist visualization methods associate the left and right eye with the sun and moon, respectively. The adept is also instructed to perform each of the 7 visualizations while practicing calm or level sitting, ping zuo, at midnight on the corresponding day. And so you can kind of map out all the days and their associations. Here, I should also mention that the Big Dipper is centrally important in the Taoist tradition. Generally speaking, Taoists view the Big Dipper as the center and pivot point of the universe. The entire cosmos turns around it. It is also associated with human fate, Ming, one's endowed destiny. Many Taoist texts claim that through Taoist training and spiritual transformation, one can change one's fate. That is, the handle of the Big Dipper is within oneself. In addition to visualization practice such as the ones just described, the Big Dipper becomes a map for the body. Sometimes it extends out from the heart, and more commonly it is imposed on the spine, with Hui Yin, the perineum, corresponding to the 1st star, and Ming Tang, the 3rd eye, corresponding to the 7th star. The 3rd major form of Taoist meditation is ingestion, also referred to as absorption. In terms of historical origins, it was also systematized by the early Shangqing, or highest clarity movement of medieval Taoism. Ingestion involves the absorption of seasonal and locality influences, as well as astral effulgences. That is, it involves gathering terrestrial and celestial energies and incorporating them into one's own body as an energetic system. Some of the most well-known methods involve ingesting the energies of the 5 directions and of the sun, moon, and stars. Like visualization, Taoist ingestion methods usually utilize traditional Chinese cosmology, specifically the various 5-phase associations. They also tend to be time-specific, so there's specific times during the day and during the seasons when you do them. For example, in a standard Taoist method, one ingests the qi of the 5 directions, often referred to as the 5 sprouts, wu ya, or the 5 energies, wu qi. One stands or sits facing east around sunrise. One brings the chi of the east and spring into the liver as vibrant green light. Each of these elements corresponds to the wood phase, and then one goes through this for each of the other 5 phases. The energies are in turn stored in the lower elixir field, and in later internal alchemy, the method is referred to as the 5 qi return to the source, wu qi gui gen. In this type of ingestion practice, one can see cosmological and seasonal dimensions, especially with respect to solar influences and cosmic energies. Another common and popular method involves ingesting solar effulgences. According to the 12th century anthology Yui Jielin Tu, the diagram of the sun and the moon, a basic practice involves standing facing the sun in the early morning. One allows the warm solar radiance to enter and infuse one's entire body. One makes the light of the sun embrace one's entire body, extending as far as the edges of the stomach, and infusing one with a feeling of being completely illuminated, both internally and externally, end quote. Whoever regularly practices such exercises will acquire radiant complexion, quote unquote, and one's whole body will become luminous, quote unquote. The same text also describes a more complex method wherein the sun and moon are associated with specific deities. In all of these exercises, one exchanges qualities with the sun and moon, specifically as pure yang, heaven and fire, and pure yin, earth and water, energies of the cosmos. Thus, primordial ethers and cosmic energies are taken into and circulated throughout the Taoist adept's body. The body becomes the universe, and the universe is one's body. From this Taoist perspective, one literally shifts ontological conditions, becomes a different kind of being in which subtle presences circulate and manifest in the body. In the contemporary world, these types of practices tend to utilize standing postures and movement, and be categorized as Yangsheng, nourishing life, or Qigong, Qi exercises. Some of them are employed in specifically Taoist frameworks, while others are reconceptualized, especially as part of alternative healthcare, the American health and fitness movement, and/or spiritual capitalism. Also noteworthy is the fact that contemporary Taoists have different views on the necessity and relative importance of ingestion, though health and longevity tend to remain a strong emphasis in the Taoist tradition. The 4th major form of Taoist meditation is inner observation. In terms of historical origins, inner observation was first expressed in late medieval Taoist monasticism, a fully integrated system in which Shangqing was the highest ordination rank. Inner observation developed during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907, under the influence of Buddhist insight or mindfulness meditation. On the most basic level, Taoist inner observation involves contemplating the body and purifying consciousness. However, in contrast to its Buddhist counterpart, Taoist inner observation does not primarily involve non-discriminating awareness of phenomenon or confirmation of Buddhist doctrine through meditation practice. Rather, it focuses on the human body as a manifestation of the Tao, rather than a samsaric emanation, and on the body as microcosm. In this way, inner observation incorporates some Buddhist psychological and soteriological insights with earlier Taoist views of the body as landscape and universe. The anonymous 8th century Nei Guanjing, Scripture on Inner Observation, and Ding Guanjing, Scripture on Concentration and Observation, both emphasize a foundational practice that parallels classical Taoist apophatic meditation, albeit with a Buddhist slant on the purification of consciousness. So, for example, they talk about the removal of defilements and vexations from one's consciousness. However, a more distinctive element focuses on the body as microcosm. For example, the Nei Guanjing begins by describing the Taoist body, quote-unquote, as comprised of the 3 Huan, the ethereal souls, the 7 Po, corporeal souls, the spirits of the 5 Yin organs associated with the 5 phases, the 6 Yang organs associated with the 6 notes, and so forth. The Taoist practitioner not only understands this theoretically, so as an informing worldview, but also gains experiential confirmation through inner observation, that is, through practice. In one of the more distinctive phases of inner observation, the aspiring adept focuses on the 5 spiritual presences associated with the 5 Yin organs. the liver, heart, spleen, lungs, and kidneys. Here one notes a continuation of earlier Taoist visualization and ingestion practices. According to the Neiguan Jing, quote, "In the 5 yin organs, the following spirit manifestations reside: the ethereal soul in the liver, corporeal soul in the lungs, vital essence in the kidneys, intention or thought in the spleen, and spirit in the heart. These appellations vary according to their respective positions. The heart belongs to the fire phase. Fire is the essence of the south and of greater yang. Above, it is governed by the planet Mars. Below, it corresponds to the heart. Its color is red, and it consists of 3 valves that resemble a lotus flower." End quote. The text then goes on to describe various other psychosomatic dimensions of personhood. Through inner observation practice, one transforms negative dimensions of self into their positive counterparts. One also investigates and realizes the body as a manifestation of the Tao, as a microcosm interpenetrating with the larger universe. The final type of Taoist meditation, internal alchemy, first became systematized during the late Tang Dynasty and Northern Song Dynasty, 960 to 1127. Taken as a whole, internal alchemy often incorporates the other 4 forms of Taoist meditation, though it should not be taken as superior or primary because of that fact. Internal alchemy emphasizes complex physiological methods to transform one's psychosomatic experience. More often than not, it is a stage-based process of energetic transformation. From the Song Dynasty onward, internal alchemy became the dominant form of Taoist meditation, though some Taoists have preferred other approaches. There are diverse forms of internal alchemy, with the technical specifics differing among different practitioners, movements, and lineages. More often than not, internal alchemy has an esoteric dimension. It tends to be lineage-specific and requires guidance under a master. As expressed in the early text of the Zhonglu, so-called Nanzong Southern School and Shenzhen Complete Perfection movements, the practice is extremely complex, through which the practitioner aims to unite the composite dimensions of the self into a unified being. The latter is often referred to as the Yang spirit, Yang Shen, or body beyond the body, Shen Wai Shen. That is, from a traditional Neidan perspective, immortality and transcendence are created, not given. One does not have an eternal soul. Rather, one is a composite self destined to dissipate into the cosmos after death, unless one practices internal alchemy. As one moves into the late imperial and modern periods, Taoist internal alchemy becomes popularized and simplified in new lineages. The process of simplification and popularization was expressed in explicit descriptions and illustrated manuals. This process culminated in certain forms of contemporary Qigong. In any case, one relatively accessible late imperial expression, which remains popular in contemporary Neidan circles, is the Wu Liu system. This lineage is technically a sublineage of Longmen or Dragon Gate, the most prominent lineage of Shenzhen Complete Perfection on the contemporary monastic order. It is named after the Longmen Taoist monk Wu Shouyang and the Chan Buddhist monk Liu Huayang. I have selected the Huiming Jing, the Scripture on Wisdom and Life Destiny, one of Liu Huayang's most influential texts, because it is relatively accessible and representative of basic internal alchemy practice. The title of the text refers to spiritual illumination associated with spirit and vitality associated with the body and physical health. The Huiming Jing is a late 18th century text on Taoist internal alchemy combined with Chan meditation and soteriology. In terms of contemplative practice, the Huiming Jing describes an 8-stage process of alchemical transformation according to the following diagrams and corresponding instructions. So the diagram of dissipation, the diagram of the 6 phases, the diagram of the governing and conception channels, of the embryo of the Tao, the emergence of the embryo, the transformation body, wall gazing, and disappearance into the empty void. The text begins with a now standardized corporeal landscape, emphasizing the abdominal region as the lower elixir field, the Sha Dan Tian, as the place where qi is stored, and the body as a system of meridians, or intersecting energetic pathways. Aspiring adepts are first instructed to seal themselves off from every source of dissipation, including sensory engagement, excessive emotional and intellectual activity, and sexual stimulation. This allows one to conserve and fortify chi and spirit. Then one must activate the water wheel or microcosmic orbit, that is, connect the governing vessel along the center line of the back with the conception vessel along the center line of the torso. This is done by circulating chi up the back and down the front of the body so that the body becomes an integrated whole, so that one activates the Taoist subtle body. Through this process, in concert with the cultivation of stillness, one becomes a spiritually integrated and transformed being. Liu discusses the culmination of Wu Liu training in both Taoist and Chan Buddhist terms. One completes the immortal embryo, attains the Buddha form, returns to the source, and disappears into the void. One becomes an immortal and Buddha simultaneously. From Liu Huayang's perspective, this seems to mean the end of separate personhood and the attainment of mystical union. Considered from a more comprehensive historical perspective, Taoist meditation consists of diverse methods and goals. As we have seen, there are 5 major types of Taoist meditation, namely apophatic meditation, visualization, ingestion, inner observation, and internal alchemy. Although I have primarily focused on specific methods, Taoist meditation cannot be removed from its larger religious and soteriological system. These systems include aesthetics, dietetics, ethics, health and longevity practice, ritual, scripture study, and so forth. In addition, Taoists tend to emphasize the importance of community and place. Utilizing comparative typologies and categories of contemplative practice, Taoist meditation includes both apophatic or unitive and cataphatic or dualistic types. That is, there are some forms of Taoist meditation that are non-conceptual, non-dualistic, contentless, and monistic, and there are other forms that are devotional and theistic. Although the primary Taoist approach involves solitary meditation, there are communal types of Taoist meditation as well. The latter tend to be monastic and follow Chan Buddhist models. Finally, there are strong theological dimensions to Taoist contemplative practice. This includes somatic theology, in which one locates or discovers gods in one's own body. The study of Taoist meditation has larger implications for and applications to the emerging interdisciplinary field of contemplative studies. It reveals that there's diversity not only between, but also within religious tradition. It draws our attention to the ways in which specific types of contemplative practice are expressions of specific religious and soteriological systems. It expands our understanding of religious diversity, including the challenges of taking religious traditions seriously on their own terms. As mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I would also emphasize the importance of adopting an inclusive and pluralistic approach, of not privileging one type of meditation as normative. The inclusion of Taoist meditation in the comparative study of contemplative practice encourages us to consider the diversity and complexity of other traditions as well. Although research on meditation has tended to privilege Buddhist meditation, especially Vipassana, Japanese Zazen, and now Tibetan Buddhist forms, every major religious tradition has its contemplative and mystical elements. Finally, we may develop more sophisticated and nuanced cartographies of contemplative practice. In this respect, we might utilize at least the following typologies: alchemical, apophatic, attentional, communal, concentrative, devotional, dualistic, ecstatic, enstatic, ergotropic, cataphatic, kinesthetic, montic, mantric, mediumistic, mystical, and get the point. Thank you very much for your attention. Should I turn the lights on? Are you prepared for that? Slowly. Good. It's okay. Do you want to stretch for a moment, or we're ready for questions? Can I talk without the microphone? Do I have to? Do we have questions? Comments?
I had a question. You mentioned the importance of place in Taoism, and I wanted to learn more about the constellation practice you were talking about. Did that happen indoors, visualizing the constellations, or did people sit outside and look at them?
So did everyone hear the question? Okay. It seems that probably it was both. That there were some practices that involved actually sitting inside of sometimes what's called like a pure chamber, so a meditation room, and then visualizing it. And then there were a lot of practices where you literally were outside connecting with the particular energies of a given constellation. And that's still the case today.
Are there any issues then with light pollution in that industrializing?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, where you live, I mean, not just light pollution, but the quality of qi where you live. So the first layer is, is the qi of your surrounding environment actually nourishing your health and kind of spiritual well-being? So forget about the Big Dipper, right? Like, can you see the Big Dipper? Well, if you can't see the Big Dipper, you've got bigger issues. From a Taoist perspective.
You mentioned an anachronistic definition of qi. What would you suggest is a good one?
I wouldn't translate it. So, yeah. So in general, I think Tao, Yin Yang, Qi, these are best left untranslated, and then we just explain them. I mean, the etymology of qi is helpful. I mean, I don't know if you know Chinese, but sometimes.
Japanese, a little.
Okay, well that's helpful too. Steam over rice, so it has this idea of the transformation from something more material to something more subtle. I tend to translate it as like subtle breath, but it can also be physical respiration. So it can have many meanings. There are also many types of qi. But this is one of those technical terms that I prefer to be left untranslated. Other religious traditions get away with a lot in terms of untranslated terms. I think we can have 4. Tao, Yin, Yang, and Qi. I think that's, yeah. But a lot of people translate it as energy. There is a kind of parallel conception, but, there's a history behind what energy is. And I think that's what I'm kind of hinting at, is thinking more, how was this concept understood indigenously? Yeah, rather than in terms of like contemporary astrophysics or something like that, which is where people tend to go.
That's helpful.
Yeah, is that okay? Other things?
Thanks so much. Would you speak more about the development or context and maybe the content about the female? Is it method?
Yeah, sorry. I really, I felt like I was already doing so much. So what happens is, one of the pivotal figures, it's interesting you bring this up because I'm actually presenting a paper in China in a few months on this person. Sun Bu'er, I don't know if you know Taoist history at all, but Sun Bu'er was the only female member of Quanzhen, of complete perfection. So in the 12th century, she was the only senior disciple of the founder, Wang Changyao. And we have a series of poems that are attributed to her, and more than likely she wrote. And you have evidence for the beginning of a kind of New Dan female alchemy tradition there. But it's really not until the Ming, so much later, like the 17th century, where you have fully developed female alchemy emerging. And unfortunately, not a lot of research has been done on this. There are a couple younger female scholars, as you might expect, who are starting to work on this. One thing that you find is that a lot of the New Dan, the female alchemy systems, tend to be exactly the same as the male versions, except women tend to focus on breast health first, and also attention to menstrual period. So there are specific practices that you do to help kind of fortify your foundational health that's different from men, obviously, because there's a kind of monthly given in the case of women. Yeah, keep going.
This may be totally not related, but are there any differences in, I don't know if they are, like concentration practices, or there's difference?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have maps of female alchemy at this point, the way that we can kind of map out internal alchemy. So we don't know all the different expressions of it. So I can't really answer that question. What you do tend to get, though, is in New Dan in female alchemy, is there's a much stronger concentration on the heart. So in the internal alchemy practice, men are generally focusing on what's called the lower elixir field, the abdominal region, and women are focusing more on the heart. And there are a number of reasons from a traditional Chinese perspective related to that. Spirit, but also connected to blood. And so it's a really fascinating question about, does spirit from a traditional Chinese perspective have a root in actual blood? So there's a kind of material component and connection. And that's something a few people are starting to think about, but it's not very well researched. Yeah. Is that at least a little bit helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I wondered also about the possible conjunction of science and spirituality. I know in India there wasn't a separation like that, that the spiritual interest and prana that came from the planets fueled the scientific investigation. Did that same thing happen in China?
There is overlap. There's definitely, I think it depends on how you think about the development of science and what science can reasonably be said to be before, the modern period.
Right.
But in the context of the development of something like internal alchemy and external alchemy, there's a lot of connection with the development of chemistry in China, for instance. So Joseph Needham has published, he and his collaborators published, 25 volumes called Science and Civilization in China, and they go through a lot of those questions. But yeah, there definitely were intersection points between so-called scientific traditions and so-called religious or spiritual traditions in China as well.
Do they remain?
I would tend to say not so much, no. And also I think that there are some strange attempts to try to conceptualize Taoism as science to get more cultural capital in modern China. So it's a kind of, I think, political issue as well. And a lot of it is. So if you look at contemporary Taoism, it's lost a lot of its cultural capital in contemporary China. So they're doing everything they can to try to convince people that Taoism really deserves to be respected. So, Taoism is the most ecological tradition. There's a political dimension to that. Taoism is a really scientific tradition. There's a political dimension to that. So there are a lot of layers to these kinds of things.
One more thing, is that what you meant by, I think you said spiritual capitalism? Is that
What I meant by spiritual capitalism was the idea that we use these traditions to make money. That's what I mean. So in my own way of thinking about the contemplative practice in the contemporary world, I think we're developing a vocabulary of how to analyze it appropriately. And so, for instance, like Professor Roth has put forward the idea of spiritual imperialism. So I think that, or cognitive imperialism. And so, I think I'm trying to think through some of those categories as well. That is, what is the intent behind religiously committed contemplative practice? It's definitely not to make money. And if you read the Taoist materials carefully, it's definitely not to be more unique in terms of your identity. It's not to be more famous in terms of your life. So you start filling in those details from the contemporary American situation, and there's a lot of deviation from, I think, those values. That is not necessarily good or bad, but I think from a Taoist perspective, it's a deviation. That's what I'm trying to get to. Is if these practices become a means to make a lot of money and become famous, it seems to contradict the foundational worldview of what they're using. Yeah. So there's a way to kind of use the tradition to think through some of the appropriations of it. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, with the revision of Taoism, instead of having philosophical
Yeah.
practice, what implications, this is a broad question, but what implications for the Chinese medicine is there in terms of is Taoism the foundation for the medicine, or is there some separation?
Can everyone hear the question about the relationship between Chinese medicine? Yeah, this is another area that needs a lot more research. Basically, Paul Unschuld is the main person who's tried to investigate it, but his work is really important. It's really great, especially on the level of the history of Chinese medicine. But I think it's really problematic in terms of his understanding of Taoism. because he's focusing on a particular aspect of Taoism, mainly, I would say, demonological and exorcistic medicine. And that's what he categorizes as Taoist. But there are a lot of other kinds of Taoist medicine. And then you have specific Taoists who are famous physicians. So we don't really know how much intersection there was. I mean, we can see parallels, but when you're looking for specific examples of the connections, especially in that earlier period, like things like Ma Wang-gui, like in the 2nd century BCE, there's a lot. It looks like there's a lot of overlap. But then you look at something like the Zhuangzi, and the Zhuangzi has a strong critique. I mean, it's a particular part of the Zhuangzi, but it has a strong critique of like Dao Yin practice, for instance. So something that might be more therapeutic or medical, they're saying you shouldn't do this because or it's a lower form of practice. Apophatic meditation is a higher form of practice. You know, so there's some kind of debate going on there, obviously. Yeah, they're not, it's not like they're just going, let me just make this up. They're going, there are a bunch of like Dao Yin people that are starting to make some headway in this culture, and they're not listening to us about apophatic meditation as much. So I think it's a really interesting question. We just don't have a lot of research done on it.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
I always wondered about why people swallow saliva as part of the meditative practice.
Yeah. You read my dissertation.
I don't remember.
So one key idea, like one distinctive aspect of Taoist practice is the idea that when you're doing serious Taoist practice, you will generate clear fluids. So it's actually not spit. And I think this is a kind of common misunderstanding. It's not like ordinary spittle in your mouth. It's actually clear fluids that are generated in practice. And they'll accumulate in your mouth, and so you swallow them. So I think on the most basic level, it's this idea of conservation. What you have in Taoism is a constant emphasis on conservation. Conservation of Jing, so the fluids are connected with Jing, they're connected with your kind of foundational vitality. The conservation of Qi, the conservation of spirit, all of these kinds of things, so you kind of want to seal yourself in and guard all of those things. When you really get into fluid physiology, which I don't know a lot about, but fortunately my wife knows a lot about, so I get to have discussions with her about internal alchemy practice from a Chinese medical perspective, there is a whole sophisticated Chinese medical understanding of how fluids are generated and what fluids do in the body, and then that, by swallowing it, you're feeding it back into that system. Yeah. And then there are other elements as well, but that's one of them. Yeah. I don't know, are we out of time, or you tell me? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.